Part 1, the day America learned it wasn't ready, a sergeant is running. Not advancing, not retreating in good order. Running. Across the floor of a Tunisian mountain pass, through a landscape of burning vehicles and abandoned guns, past equipment that still works, past men who are still alive, past everything that was supposed to be his job to protect. His boots are hitting the dirt and his lungs are pulling at the desert air, and the thing behind him is not going to stop because he runs faster. The thing behind him is a Panzer IV from Rommel's Afrika Korps. And in the first minute of this battle, the sergeant understood something that no training exercise had ever prepared him to understand. He was not ready for this. The date was February 14th, 1943. The place was Kasserine Pass, a gap in the dorsal mountain range in central Tunisia. And what was happening there was not a battle the United States Army was losing. It was a battle the United States Army was failing to fight at all. Erwin Rommel was 51 years old. He was also exhausted, sick with a digestive ailment that had been grinding him down for months. And by this point in the war, he already knew something that most of the Germans he served had not yet accepted. The Afrika Korps was going to lose North Africa. The math was not in doubt. The Allies had too much, Germany had too little, and the supply lines across the Mediterranean were being cut by British and American naval forces a little more every month. He knew this. He had told Hitler. Hitler had not listened. What Rommel had instead was one more chance to do what he had always done, not win the campaign. He understood that was beyond him, but hit hard enough, fast enough, in the right place, that the enemy would still be staggering when the end finally came. Buy time. Inflict costs. Make the Americans pay for something before they could learn from paying for it. The attack began on February 14th. Within 2 days, the American defensive lines in the pass had not bent. They had dissolved. German armor moved through positions that should have been held, through gaps that should not have existed, past equipment that American soldiers abandoned in their rush to get away from what was hitting them. The numbers, when the fighting stopped a week later, were not numbers that a military can look at with anything except honest acknowledgement of what went wrong. 6,500 American casualties, 4,000 Americans taken prisoner, 183 tanks destroyed or captured, 194 artillery pieces lost. The single worst defeat suffered by the United States Army in the entire North African campaign, measured in men and machines surrendered to the enemy in a matter of days. Rommel did not push further after he had broken through, not because American resistance stopped him, but because his ammunition was running low, his fuel situation was precarious, and British forces under Montgomery were pressing from the south. He stopped because the logistics of his own position made stopping the rational choice. Not because anything Fredendall had done. That name is important. Lloyd Fredendall, 59 years old. Major General, commanding the American Second Corps, the formation responsible for the sector that had just been shattered. He was a man who had served his country for decades, who had risen through the ranks on the strength of peacetime evaluations that could not test the one thing that mattered in a fight. In the 2 months the Second Corps had been in the field in Tunisia, Fredendall had not once visited the front lines. Not once. His command post was a bunker dug 2 miles behind the fighting line. The engineering troops who built it spent weeks carving it out of the rock, while the men at the front were short of supplies. His orders traveled by radio to units he had never seen in ground he could not have described from personal observation. The men who were supposed to execute those orders were fighting in terrain their commander had never stood on. When the attack came, the disconnect between the orders being issued and the reality of what was happening in the pass was complete. Not because the men were cowards. Most of them were not. Not because they lacked the basic ability to fight. Many of them had been in the field for months and had learned things about desert warfare that no training manual covered. They broke because they had never been led by someone who had come to see what they were actually facing. And when it was over, when the count of the dead and the captured and the equipment abandoned in the pass was being assembled into a report that would travel to Allied headquarters in Algiers, a 52-year-old general named Dwight Eisenhower sat in his office and looked at what had happened to the army he was commanding. Eisenhower was not a man who panicked. He was a man who thought. And what he thought, staring at those numbers, was this: I have to fix this. I have to fix it fast. And there is only one person in the American military who might be able to do what needs to be done in the time I have left to do it. He did not pick up the phone with enthusiasm. He picked it up because he had no other choice. The name was Patton. George Smith Patton Jr. was 57 years old. He believed in reincarnation. He carried 2 pistols with ivory grips. He made speeches that embarrassed his superiors and read history books that most of his colleagues had never heard of. He had been on the invasion of North Africa, and he had done well there. And then he had been set aside, while the professionals managed the next phase of the campaign. He was watching the war happen without him, and he understood better than anyone who had been watching the Second Corps from a distance exactly what had gone wrong and exactly what it would take to fix it. Not new tanks, not new training programs, not reorganized staff procedures. Something simpler than that. Something that took nothing except the willingness to be present when it was difficult to be present. He knew what he was going to do when Eisenhower called. He was going to go where the problem was and stand in the middle of it until the problem changed. Part 2, 10 days. The Jeep pulled up to the Second Corps command post on the morning of March 6th, 1943. The man who stepped out of it was not the kind of person any of the men present had seen walk out of a vehicle before. The collar insignia were crisp. The helmet was polished to the point where you could have used it as a mirror. The ivory-handled pistols sat at his hips in a way that suggested they were not ceremonial. And the expression on his face said, without any ambiguity, that he had not come here to share in the difficulty. He had come here to end it. This was George Patton, and he had 10 days before the next battle began. Here is what he did on the first day. He did not sit down with the operations staff. He did not review the tactical situation. He did not call a meeting of senior officers to share his vision for the future of the Corps. He issued an order. The order was this: every man in the Second Corps would wear his helmet at all times. Every man would wear his uniform in full. Violations would result in immediate fines, levied on the spot by any officer who observed them. The response from the men who heard this order ranged from bafflement to outright anger. They were in a combat zone. They had just been routed by the most experienced armored force in the world, and their new commanding general was worried about helmets. This is the part that is easy to misread as theater. It was not theater. It was philosophy. Patton believed, from everything he had read and everything he had lived, that the external expression of discipline was not separate from the internal capacity for discipline. It was the same thing, measured at different scales. A man who would not discipline himself to wear a helmet when no one was watching would not discipline himself to hold a position when the pressure came. The small capitulations and the large capitulations were connected. Fix the small ones, and you had begun the work on the large ones. The men hated it. They wore their helmets. What Patton did next was not hold briefings. He drove every day. For the 10 days between his arrival and the opening of the next engagement, he drove a Jeep to the front, not to a command post a safe distance behind the fighting. To the battalions, to the companies, to the places where the officers and men who had run at Kasserine were still trying to understand what had happened to them and whether it was going to happen again. He watched. He asked questions. He fired the ones who gave him answers that told him they had already given up. He found the ones who still had something in their eyes, and he told them, in the direct and profane language that was his natural register, that he expected something from them. He ate with the enlisted men. He drove through areas that were under artillery fire because he needed to see the ground himself. He gave every senior officer who worked for him the same basic instruction: do not tell me what you cannot do. Tell me what you are going to do instead. There was nothing magical about any of this. There was nothing that required genius. What it required was the willingness to be where the problem was, instead of somewhere more comfortable, every single day until the problem changed. Now, here is the piece of this story that does not appear in most accounts, and it changes the shape of everything. On March 9th, 1943, 3 days after Patton took command of the Second Corps, Erwin Rommel boarded an aircraft at an airfield in Tunisia and flew to Germany. He did not return to Africa. He never commanded troops in the theater again. The official reason given was health. The actual reason was this: Hitler did not want Rommel present when North Africa fell. Rommel was the most famous German general alive. He was a propaganda asset the Reich could not afford to watch surrender. So he was pulled out, given a medical rationale, and removed from the equation before the last chapter was written. What this means for the story told in the title is something that every honest account of the period has to acknowledge. Patton took command of the Second Corps while Rommel was still technically in Tunisia. They overlapped by 3 days. And in those 3 days, Rommel flew away, and they never faced each other in the field. Not once. The German commander Patton would actually fight was Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, 53 years old, a capable, professional, experienced officer who had taken over the Axis forces in Tunisia and was doing his best with a position that was already strategically lost. He was not Rommel, but he was what was there. On March 23rd, 1943, the 1st Infantry Division of the United States Army, under Major General Terry Allen, held its position against a German armored assault at a place called El Guetar. They did not win in the sense of destroying the enemy or breaking through the line. The losses were high. The advance, such as it was slow. What happened at El Guetar was this: the men did not run. The same soldiers, in many cases from the same units, who had run at Kasserine Pass 5 weeks earlier, stood at El Guetar and absorbed the attack and held their ground. That was the thing Patton did in 10 days. Not retrain the Corps, not re-equip it, not introduce new tactics or new doctrine or new organizational structures. The time for any of that had not existed. What he did was create the conditions under which men who had already broken once were willing to believe they would not break again. Difference between breaking and not breaking at El Guetar on March 23rd was the difference between a defeat and a line that held. The battle was not a decisive American victory, it needs to be said plainly. El Guetar stopped a German armored thrust. It did not win Tunisia. After the fighting at El Guetar, Patton was pulled back to begin planning for Sicily. Omar Bradley took over the Second Corps. The German and Italian forces in Tunisia were ground down over the following weeks and finally surrounded and forced to surrender in May of 1943. There is also a piece of the mythology around this story that needs to be addressed, because it has been repeated so many times that many people believe it is real. The line most associated with this period, the declaration that is quoted in books and films and documentaries whenever the name Patton and the name Rommel appear in the same sentence, is this one: Rommel, you magnificent bastard. I read your book. It is one of the most memorable lines in the long history of military cinema. It is from a film made in 1970, 25 years after the events it depicts. There is no documented evidence that Patton said it at El Guetar or anywhere else in the actual field. What is documented is something less dramatic and more interesting. Patton had read Rommel's writing. He had studied it seriously, the way he studied most things he considered important. And at Sicily, in the campaigns that followed Tunisia, he applied what he had learned from Rommel's tactical thinking against German forces who were operating on principles Rommel himself had developed. He fought with Rommel's ideas when he could no longer fight Rommel himself. That is the real version of the story. Less cinematic, more honest, and in its own way, more striking. Part 3, the end of two men who never faced each other. Tunisia ended in May of 1943. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, the largest Axis capitulation since Stalingrad, in a theater that had consumed years of German strategic investment and tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Campaign was over. The continent of Africa no longer held an Axis army. Rommel had been correct about one thing. He could not hold North Africa. The numbers had never been in his favor, and he had known it, and he had said it, and he had been overruled, and now it was done. He had been wrong about something else. He had dismissed the American military as an organization that could not learn, could not adapt, could not be made into what it would need to be to fight the war to its end. He had formed that opinion at Kasserine, watching men run from something they had never been prepared to face, led by an officer who had never seen the ground he was ordering them to hold. What he did not see, because he had left before it happened, was what those same men looked like at El Guitar. Patton did not stay in Tunisia long enough to see the final surrender. He had been extracted to plan the next operation. The campaign that had begun with American disaster at Kasserine Pass was finished by the formations he had studied, under a commander he had chosen, on ground he had left behind. He did not particularly celebrate this. He was already looking at the maps of Sicily. The two men who gave this story its shape would never come into direct contact with each other again. They would exist in the same war, on opposite sides, for another year. They would each contribute to the shape of that war. But they would not meet across a line of battle, would not come to grips in the way that the mythology of the period has sometimes suggested they did. Rommel went to France in late 1943, assigned to inspect and then command the coastal defenses against the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. He argued about strategy with his superiors, as he always had, and was overruled, as he always was. He believed the tanks needed to be forward, close to the beaches. His superiors kept them back. When the landings came on June 6th, 1944, the tanks were not in the right place to stop them. On July 17th, 1944, a British fighter aircraft strafed the car. Rommel was riding in on a French road. He was thrown from the vehicle and suffered a fractured skull and serious injuries to his face and eyes. He was evacuated and spent months recovering. In August of 1944, the investigation into the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler began to reach people connected to those involved. Rommel's name appeared in documents recovered from conspirators. The connection was indirect and disputed, and Rommel himself maintained he had known nothing specific about the plot. Whether he was telling the complete truth is something historians have argued about ever since. What is not argued about is what happened in October of 1944. Two German officers came to the house where Rommel was recovering and presented him with a choice. He could face public trial before a people's court, which would mean a public execution and the certain harassment and probable arrest of his family. Or he could take a capsule they had brought with them and be given a state funeral with full military honors and a guarantee that his family would be protected. He asked for 15 minutes to say goodbye to his wife and son. He was buried with the ceremony befitting a field marshal. The announcement said he had died of his wounds from the July attack. The truth was kept from the German public for years. It was kept from the world for longer than that. Patton survived the war. He was there at the end, commanding the Third Army through France and into Germany, moving at the speed he had always believed was the only speed worth moving at. He made statements in the closing weeks that alarmed his superiors. He expressed views about the post-war relationship with Germany and with the Soviet Union that the political realities of 1945 could not accommodate. He was reassigned to a ceremonial command in September. In December of 1945, 4 months after the Japanese surrender, his car was struck by a military truck on a German road near Mannheim. He suffered a fractured cervical vertebra and was paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days in a Heidelberg hospital. He died on December 21st, 1945. He never saw the United States again. He was buried in Luxembourg among the soldiers of the Third Army at his request. He never had the confrontation with Rommel that he had imagined. He had studied the man, learned from him, applied what he learned against German forces who were using the same principles Rommel had developed. He had measured himself against Rommel's reputation and his methods. But the battle he wanted, the direct test against the man himself, had always been on the other side of something. First it was that Rommel left Tunisia before Patton could close. Then it was that Sicily came before North Africa finished. Then it was other theaters, other assignments, other fronts. And then it was 1944, and Rommel was in France, and then he was dead in a farmhouse in Germany with a poison capsule that had been handed to him by his own government. Now, what does this story actually say? Not what the mythology says. Not the version with the famous line from the 1970 film. The dramatic confrontation between two gladiators of the Second World War, the American emerging triumphant from a battle of wills with the desert fox. The real version is quieter and more complicated and more interesting. Rommel looked at the American military at Kasserine and drew a conclusion that was reasonable based on what he had seen. The command was poor. The men were untested. The system had failed to prepare them for what they were facing. He dismissed them, and in February of 1943, he was not wrong to do so. What he did not account for was the 10 days, not 10 months, not 10 weeks of retraining. 10 days in which one man drove a jeep to the front every morning, wore his own helmet, ate with the enlisted men, fired the officers who had already given up, and stood in front of the ones who had not and told them, in his particular way, that he expected them to hold. The men at El Guettar were not different soldiers than the men who had run at Kasserine. They were the same soldiers. What had changed was the thing that Fredendall, sitting in his bunker 2 miles from the fighting, had been unable to give them and unwilling to try. They believed someone was paying attention. They believed someone had come to see what they were facing. They believed, for reasons they could not have fully articulated at the time, that the person giving the orders had been to the places the orders applied to. That belief, as thin and intangible as it sounds, is what Patton built in 10 days. And it held a line at El Guettar that Rommel, writing in his diary in Germany, had not believed the American military could hold. 2 men are buried on opposite sides of what was once a battlefield. One in Luxembourg, one in Bavaria, not far from each other in the European geography that they had each done so much to reshape. They never had their direct confrontation. The war and its logistics and its politics conspired in the particular way that actual history conspires rather than the way that stories are written to keep the meeting from happening. What happened instead was this. The army that Rommel had beaten at Kasserine learned from being beaten. The commander who replaced the one who had been hiding in the bunker came out of the bunker and drove to the front and stood in the dirt with the men who were going to have to fight the next battle. And the men who had run came back and held. That is the answer to the question in the title. It is not a triumph of one great man over another great man in a clash of military titans. It is something less dramatic and more human than that. It is what happens when you stop managing from a safe distance and start leading from where the problem actually is. Rommel did not destroy Patton's army in 48 hours. He destroyed the army that Fredendall had made, and Patton, in 10 days, made a different one.